All right. Diving in today, folks, getting a bit philosophical, exploring language and testimony, but not just anywhere in the world of philosophy. No, we're heading over to classical Indian philosophy.
Yeah, exactly. So we're really going to be looking at how those thinkers, way back when, grappled with pretty fundamental stuff. Like, where does language even come from? What is it? Meaning, knowledge, the whole 9 yards.
We're going deep. Perfect for our listeners, though, right? I mean, if you're tuning in, chances are you love a good, thought-provoking deep dive. This one especially, we're going to be looking closely at an entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, all about language and testimony in classical Indian philosophy, really trying to bring out those nuggets of wisdom, those aha moments, without getting too bogged down.
Absolutely. And just to give a little roadmap, we'll start way back in the Vedic period, where language was something pretty mystical. Then we'll move on to the Sanskrit grammarians, the real word nerds of their time who dissected language like nobody's business. And finally, we'll get into all those different philosophical schools in India, the arguments about scripture, the nature of meaning, you name it. Should be a wild ride.
Buckle up. Let's start with those early Vedic conceptions of language, shall we? Somewhere around 1500 to 500 BCE. Now, Vak, that's our keyword here, Sanskrit for language, right?
Mm-hmm.
But even then, it wasn't so simple. The Vedic sages, they drew some distinctions.
Yeah, they weren't just poets, they were philosophers of language in their own right. So first, there's this distinction between their own carefully crafted language and everyone else's. But more importantly, there's this idea of divine language, Devivak, set apart from regular, everyday human speech.
So, Devivak, are we talking like super fancy poetry here or something more? What made it divine?
Well, they believed it was literally created by the gods. Not just inspired, but actually brought forth by them. And get this, they believed only a quarter of this divine language was accessible to us mere mortals. The other 3/4, hidden, transcendental, They thought their insights gave them a unique peek behind the curtain, so to speak. And the flip side, of course, was that languages outside their tradition, they lacked that divine spark.
So right there, you've got a hierarchy of language and maybe even knowledge itself. If only certain ways of speaking are considered divine, what does that mean for everything else?
It gets even more complex. Language wasn't just a tool for these sages. It was woven into the cosmic fabric, intertwined with divine power. Hymns, prayers, rituals, these weren't just words, they were actions, they had an effect. The spoken word could influence the gods, bring about real change in the world. That's how deeply they revered language, even deifying it as Vakti, the goddess of speech, alongside other speech-related divinities like Brahmanaspati and Bahaspati.
Almost like the word itself had a power, a reality beyond just being a symbol, right? Like linguistic realism or something.
You're hitting on something really important there, and it gets even more intense when you look at the Yogveda, specifically hymn 10.125. Vakdevi herself sings her own praises, declares her primordial nature, demands worship. It's not just a tool anymore. Language is a fundamental creative principle.
And this ties into the whole concept of Brahman, right? How it evolved from a spoken thing to this ultimate reality.
Exactly. You see, at first, Brahman referred to the potent ritual utterance, the power within the sacred chant, even the priest who spoke it. But as we move into the Upanishadic period, Brahman becomes this ultimate, impersonal ground of all being. The creative power that was once attributed to the spoken word now becomes the very essence of existence itself.
So speaking, especially in a sacred context, was like tapping into this ultimate creative force, maybe even giving it form. What about the Vedas themselves? What was their status during this period?
Well, initially, the hymns were seen as the work of specific poet sages. They were called karu, meaning craftsman, or mantrak, maker of hymns. So the emphasis was on their human creativity. But as the Vedic tradition solidified, this idea of an impersonal origin emerged. There's this verse in the Yogveda, 10.90.9, which says that the verses, the melodies, the sacrificial formulas all came from the primordial sacrifice of this cosmic being. The idea that the scriptures were not authored by individuals gained traction. Eventually, it led to the belief that the Vedas are aparudya, unauthored and eternal, existing outside the cycles of creation and destruction.
This concept of aparudya, that's going to be crucial later, right? When we get into the debates about scriptural authority. Because it shifts the authority away from a fallible human and towards something eternal, something beyond us.
Precisely. And there's another interesting concept from the Brahmanas, rupasamti, the perfection of ritual form. The idea was that if the incantation was recited perfectly, it would mirror the desired outcome and thus be more effective. It suggests this early intuition about the relationship between language and reality, a kind of correspondence. And then in the Upanishads, language, particularly OM, is explored as a tool for meditation, a path towards union with Brahman. But even then, there's this acknowledgement that language can't fully capture the essence of Brahman, which is beyond all concepts. In the end, silence is often seen as the most appropriate response to ultimate reality.
So we see this evolution from language as a divine tool, then to a creative force in its own right, and finally to something that both points towards and falls short of the ultimate truth. It's a fascinating trajectory. But now let's shift gears a bit and talk about those Sanskrit grammarians. They brought a different kind of vigor to the study of language, right? More of a focus on structure.
Absolutely. Think of them as the pioneers of linguistics, really dissecting the nuts and bolts of Sanskrit. Putkini, around the 4th century BCE, he saw Sanskrit as this atemporal language, a stable system underlying all the regional variations and the differences between how it was used in scripture versus everyday speech.
And it's within this grammatical tradition that we see debates about meaning. Like, what does a word actually refer to? Figures like Vya and Vajrayana come to mind.
Exactly. Patanjali, in his Mahavaya, dives into their contrasting views. Vyadi argued that words like cow referred to individual cows, the particularity of each one. But Vajrayana argued for a more general meaning that cow referred to the universal property of cowness. It's the classic problem of universals and particulars in Western philosophy.
So, even at this early stage, they were wrestling with these fundamental philosophical questions about the nature of reality and how language fits into it all. What else were these Sanskrit grammarians concerned with?
Well, Katyana and Patayani, writing around the turn of the Common Era, were particularly invested in the status of Sanskrit. Remember, this is a time when Buddhism and Jainism are on the rise, and they're using vernacular languages for their teachings. So for these grammarians, Sanskrit wasn't just any language, it was sacred. It was tied to the Vedas, and using it correctly was believed to have religious merit. They acknowledged that those vernaculars could communicate, but they saw them as apashabda or apafresha, deviations or corruptions of the pure Sanskrit, lacking that inherent power. They believed that the connection between Sanskrit words and their meanings was siddha, eternal, pre-established, not something humans just made up.
But then, how do they reconcile this eternal language with the obvious reality of change? I mean, languages evolve, don't they?
That's a great question, and it's a philosophical challenge they directly addressed. So, to resolve this tension between the eternality nitya of language and the fact that it changes, vikara, they came up with this idea. They said that what we perceive as change, like a shift in verb conjugation, isn't actually a modification of an eternal word itself. It's more like a substitution. One whole eternal word form is replaced by another. Change is more about usage, not about the underlying reality of language itself.
So the fundamental units, the words themselves, they remain eternal, even if how we use them changes according to grammar rules. Which brings us to the concept of sfofa, something Patanjali is known for. What problem was he trying to solve with this idea?
Sfo is all about getting at the essence of sound and meaning, especially when spoken words are so fleeting. But Patanjali made a distinction between sfuta, the true underlying and unchanging essence of a word, and dvani, the actual sound we hear, which can vary in pitch, duration, all those things. The philosophical puzzle was this. How can a word, which we experience as a series of sounds that disappear as soon as they're uttered, convey a meaning that is stable and enduring? Patanjali's answer involved mental impressions. He thought that as we hear the individual sounds, they leave these impressions. And from those impressions, we build a complete mental image of the word, the samudaya, or vadagata. The sutta then becomes this invariant, meaning-bearing unit that is somehow manifested through those fleeting sounds, the dhvanis.
So sfuta is like the ideal form of the word, while the vani are its imperfect, temporary expressions in the world of sound.
That's a really good way to put it. And then Bhartari, around the 5th century CE, takes us even further. He claims that language itself, what he calls Shabda Brahman, is the ultimate reality. It's the foundation from which both words and the things they refer to ultimately arise. For him, the sentence is the primary unit of language, not the word. It's indivisible, and its meaning is grasped in a single intuitive flash, what he calls pratibha. Words and their individual meanings are just abstractions useful for analysis, but ultimately imagined, kalpita, lacking a separate reality.
That's a big departure from the idea that meaning is built up from smaller units, isn't it? Purtahari is going for a kind of linguistic holism. How did other schools react to this radical view?
Well, his ideas were influential, but not everyone bought into them completely. Schools like the Mimamsa, Nyayavaisheshika, and even later grammarians pushed back on the idea of the sentence being the sole primary unit. They emphasized the importance of individual word meanings and how they combine to form sentence meaning. They pointed to things like occulta, the expectancy between words, yogyata, their compatibility, and asati, their proximity, as crucial for understanding a sentence. It's more of a compositional view.
So we see a spectrum of views emerging here, from a focus on the eternal word to the primacy of the whole sentence. But now let's turn to the philosophical heavyweights and look at how they viewed the Vedas themselves. This is a big point of contention.
Yes, absolutely. As we discussed in the early Vedic period, those poet sages were seen as the creators of the hymns. But even then, the Rig Veda itself hinted at a less personal origin, with hymns arising from that primordial sacrifice. And this idea really gained momentum in later philosophical schools. The question of human authorship became central, especially in the face of challenges from other traditions.
Right, specifically from Buddhism and Jainism, who weren't too keen on the Vedas or the idea of a creator god.
Exactly. They challenged the idea that fallible humans could create something like the Vedas. They also rejected the idea of a personal god, which undermined any claim of divine authorship. Instead, they emphasized their own founders, Buddha and Mahavira, as the ultimate sources of truth and knowledge.
So the Hindu philosophical schools had to step up their game to defend the Vedas. What arguments did they come up with?
The Mimamsakas took a really interesting approach. They kind of agreed with the Buddhists and Jains that there wasn't a creator god controlling everything. Instead, they doubled down on the authority of the Vedas themselves. They argued that the Vedas were eternal, unauthored, apuruya, and inherently meaningful. They even questioned the idea of an omniscient human being. For them, the Vedas were meaningful because the relationship between words and meaning was natural and eternal. They even developed this concept of Shabda Prama, linguistic expression, specifically the Vedas, as an independent source of knowledge, especially for things like duty, dharma, and heavenly rewards, svarga, which you can't just figure out through senses or logic.
So for the Mimamsakas, the authority of the Vedas didn't come from God, but from the Vedas themselves, from their inherent nature.
Exactly. They even had two ways of understanding the eternality of the Vedas. There was Kastanijata, a kind of unchanging permanence like a mountain, and then there was Pravahanijata, a continuous flow like a river. They thought the Vedas had both. The content was eternally fixed, but the tradition of studying and transmitting them was unbroken. They also believed that word meanings were eternal, like universals, and even the sounds themselves were eternal. So the Vedic seers, the Eans, they didn't compose the Vedas, they saw them, they cognized them. It reinforces this idea of an impersonal origin and inherent validity, Svata Pramat, the self-validity of knowledge.
Which is a stark contrast to the Nyaya Vaishika school, right? They brought God back into the picture as the author of the Vedas.
Right. They also accepted the Vedas as Shabda Prama, a valid source of knowledge. But they thought all authoritative knowledge came from a trustworthy speaker, an apta. And since they didn't believe any human could be truly infallible, they argued that God, omniscient and compassionate, was the author of the Vedas. So for them, God established the connection between words and meanings, what they called sakata. Sanskrit then becomes the language of God, and vernaculars are just derivatives, lacking that same spiritual power.
It's amazing how both sides use their understanding of language, its origins, its nature, to support their philosophical views. But let's dig deeper into the concept of artha, meaning itself, and how these different schools understood it.
Absolutely. Artha is usually translated as meaning, but its precise meaning and scope really depended on each school's philosophical baggage, so to speak. Schools like Nyaya, Vaisika, and Mimamsa, they had these realist ontologies. So they thought of artha as something out there in the world, the object or state of affairs that a word points to. For the Mimamsa schools, since they were all about interpreting those Vedic injunctions, language was mostly about referring to these objective realities. The Nyaya Vaishika schools, as we said, argued for a conventional relationship, saketa, between word and artha, established by God. They'd point to things like, the word fire doesn't actually burn you, so the connection is arbitrary.
It's a more nominalist take on language, right? But the Mimamsas, they couldn't agree with that, could they? I mean, given their belief in the eternal Veda.
No, absolutely not. For them, the connection between word and meaning was as eternal as the Veda itself. It was innate, not arbitrary. Then you've got the grammarians, think it was like Praetori. They kind of walked a middle path, focusing on meaning as a mental projection, bodhartha, or buddhi pratipasa. This meant that words referring to things that don't exist, like a rabbit's horn, could still be meaningful because the meaning was in the concept, not necessarily tied to an external referent. They were more concerned with how language works in our minds, how it enables us to communicate. So the meaningfulness of a word didn't depend on it pointing to something real in the world. What mattered was the conceptual coherence. Exactly. Later on, particularly within Navyaniya, they tried to unify the terminology a bit. Gadahata defined artha as the object of verbal cognition, shabda bodha vyaya. It highlights the cognitive side of meaning. They also categorized different types of meaning based on how words signify things. You had primary meaning, shakti avitavuti muhyavati, which gives you shakyartha, vatyartha bhiya. Then secondary meaning, lokadiya, gives you latyartha. Suggestive meaning, vyanjanavati, yields vyajartha or dimatartha. And finally, there was intended meaning, tatpayati, which gives you tatparyartha. Keep in mind, though, not all schools agreed on these categories or how important they were.
And even when it came to that basic primary meaning, there was disagreement, right? Like, does bull refer to an individual bull or the universal bullness?
Yep, that was a hot topic. The Mises school generally went with the universal property. The Kevalvyaktivada school was all about the individual. The Nyaya school said it was the individual qualified by the universal property. And the grammarians, they went even further. They included things like gender, number, grammatical roles, what they called karaka, and jyotyartha, the co-signified meanings you get from particles or affixes.
It's mind-boggling how much they thought about meaning, not just taking it for granted. But how did these ideas about word meaning influence their views on sentence meaning? How do you combine those words to get the full meaning of a sentence?
That was another battlefield for them. The common view was pretty atomistic. Sentence meaning is just the sum of its parts, the individual word meanings, which might even be broken down further into smaller units. But then you had the Prabhakara Mamaso school. They came up with this idea called anvitabhyatana, which says that words inherently carry connected meanings, so sentence meaning is just the combination of those already related parts.
So even within this atomistic framework, there's a hint of holism there. But what about the other schools?
Well, the Nyaya and Bhattamimasa schools, they championed a theory called apihitambe. The idea is that words first express their individual, isolated meanings, and then those meanings are linked together syntactically to create the full sentence meaning. Interestingly, even early grammarians like Katyayana and Patanjali leaned towards this view. And then, of course, you have Bhartrhari with his radical stance. He said, the sentence is indivisible, its meaning apprehended in one flash, pratibha. Words are just abstractions from that whole.
So for Bhartrhari, sentence meaning is fundamental and word meanings are just derived from that. True linguistic holism. We've covered so much ground, from mystical views to complex semantic theories. But before we wrap up, are there any other important concepts we should touch on?
Yes, a couple more. One is the distinction between Shakata Vachadaka and Pravatinamita. It's all about the property that determines what a word refers to. Like potness is what makes something a pot and allows us to use the word pot for it. It's the defining characteristic.
So it's how we connect words to their reference through these shared properties. We also mentioned Lakaya and Vyanjana earlier. Maybe you could expand on their philosophical significance.
Of course. Lakkhana is secondary signification. It's philosophically interesting because it shows how we get meaning beyond the literal. It kicks in when the primary meaning just doesn't fit the context or the speaker's intention. The classic example is Gaugeya Go, a cowherd colony on the Ganges. Well, a colony can't be literally on the river. So through Lakkhana, we understand it to mean on the bank of the Ganges. It highlights the role of context and inference in understanding language. Then you've got Vyanjana, which is all about suggestion. This was huge in Sanskrit poetics. It's that extra layer of meaning beyond the literal and the metaphorical. It evokes emotions, associations, deeper meanings, often relying on subtle cues and shared cultural knowledge. Like that example of the lovelorn wife giving seemingly innocent instructions that actually convey a hidden invitation. That's the evocative power of Vyanjana.
Language working on multiple levels, adding depth and complexity to communication. It's incredible. So looking back at this tapestry of theories and arguments, what do you think were the driving forces behind these different approaches to language?
Well, the source material suggests it was all about their philosophical goals. Each school had its agenda. The poeticians, they cared about beauty. Grammarians, they were all about structure and how language worked in the mind. Nyayavashinka, they were building a system of logic, epistemology, ontology, with truth as correspondence. Mamasa, their goal was to defend the Vedas, hence their focus on the eternal inherent nature of language and meaning. And the Buddhists, They emphasized the limits of language because they were concerned with how it could obscure our understanding of reality. It's a good reminder that our philosophical assumptions can shape how we see even something as basic as language.
A valuable lesson indeed. To our listeners, those of you who love a good philosophical puzzle, I think this dive into classical Indian philosophy has shown just how intricate and thought-provoking their ideas about language were. From the Vedic awe of Vak to the grammarians' analyses, the debates about meaning, the arguments about scripture, these thinkers were grappling with issues that are still relevant today. We've gone from the divine origins of language to the very nature of meaning itself. And hopefully this has given you some food for thought.
I'd say so. And on that note, here's a final question to ponder. Given all we've explored about language, the different origins, the debates about meaning, the question of words versus sentences, what do you think is the most fundamental aspect of language? Is it the structure, the meaning, its ability to shape how we see the world, or its role in how we communicate and learn? These ancient debates, they still have something to teach us about the power and the mystery of language.